The notebook didn't belong there. Elon Musk noticed it the moment he stepped into the office. He had just excused himself from a tense meeting down the hall. His engineers were debating launch tolerances for a new, upper-stage propulsor, but something about the fatigue in the room had made him slip away for a moment of silence. He hadn't expected to find something waiting for him. Tucked between two thick engineering volumes, it almost vanished into the shelf. The cover was worn leather, aged to a deep brown. One corner curled outward slightly, as if it had been carried in the crook of an arm for years. But what caught his attention wasn't the notebook itself. It was the note taped to it. Not printed, handwritten. In small, careful script, the kind a person uses when they don't want to intrude, but still need to be heard. If you have a minute, this was my boy's dream. Just that. No signature, no explanation, no demand, just hope. Elon stared at the note for several seconds. There was something fragile about it, as if moving too quickly would break the spell. He pulled the notebook down and ran a thumb across the cover. The leather was cracked in places. This wasn't a new idea someone had tossed at him. This had age, memory, weight. He sat. His hands opened the notebook slowly, almost reverently, like lifting the lid of a time capsule. The first pages were childish. Rockets drawn with bright crayons, crooked stars, planets with smiling faces. In the margin of one, a tiny astronaut labeled me, pointed upward with outstretched arms. Elon smiled, a rare softness crossing his face. But the pages turned and the drawings matured. Sketches became more precise. Doodles gave way to blueprints. Formulas appeared beside hand-drawn graphs, and questions scrawled in quick, hungry handwriting. What if return energy could be looped, and possible to reuse thermal discharge from first stage cycle? He paused. That question. It wasn't just theoretical. It was one of the core questions his teams had been wrestling with for years. How to harvest unused energy during flight, how to make reusability not just possible, but elegant. And someone, this unknown my boy, had sketched a working theory for it. Elon leaned in, frowning. There were multiple versions, labeled Concept 1, Concept 2, Concept 7, Optimistic. They weren't polished. The math needed refining, but the imagination behind them, pure, unfiltered, and staggeringly ahead of its time. He flipped forward. A schematic nearly filled an entire page, a two-stage hybrid booster system with real-time energy capture from external friction, converted through compact turbine arrays. Elon blinked. He knew these ideas. They'd only started formal development 3 years ago. He looked at the date on the page, June 2009. He swore under his breath. This wasn't plagiarism. This wasn't mimicry. This was a lonely genius working alone. A mind with no access to the formal corridors of research, sketching possibility in pencil and ink and raw belief. The margins held more than math. Little notes appeared, like whispers left behind. Mom says I need sleep. Will Elon ever see this? Try again. Don't give up. Fail better. He paused, turned the page. More diagrams, more dreams, and then in tiny script, written near the bottom of several pages, almost like a signature. Michael. No last name, no address, just Michael. Elon took out his phone, snapped photos of the propulsion designs, of the thermal loop theory, of the hybrid boosters. He texted his chief of engineering. Need a full evaluation. Is this feasible? Where is this from? Found it here. I need answers. He sat back in the chair, holding the notebook on his lap, like it was made of glass. Who was this boy? Who left this here? He turned the notebook over, as if some clue would be scrawled on the back. Nothing. Just the worn leather and a faint fingerprint smear, like it had been held tightly, lovingly. He looked again at the note. If you have a minute, this was my boy's dream. He read it aloud this time softly. The room was still. The sun cast a warm stripe across the desk, catching the corner of the page. Dust floated in the golden light, undisturbed. Elon let out a slow breath, something between awe and ache. Who were you, Michael? He whispered. And he meant it. not as a question of credentials or background or education, but as a prayer. Some discoveries come from laboratories, some come from billion-dollar research, and some arrive in a leather-bound notebook quietly left on a shelf, hoping someone might care enough to open it. If this story stirred something in you, dear viewer, I invite you to walk this journey with us. No pressure, just a simple gesture. If this moment meant something to you, give the video a like so we know it found the right heart. And if you'd like to stay with us for the next chapter, you're warmly welcome to subscribe. Not because an algorithm suggested it, but because maybe like Michael, you still believe that dreams deserve to be seen. It happened on the same day, not long before Elon Musk entered his office and discovered the old leather-bound notebook. Someone else had been there, quietly, hours earlier, with nothing but a memory in her pocket and a hope so soft it barely had a name. The corridors were still asleep that morning. It was early enough that the halls echoed with every step. No voices yet, no screens blinking, just the steady rhythm of a mop moving across smooth tile and the gentle creak of an old cleaning cart. Helen moved through the silence like a prayer. At 72, she no longer hurried. Her joints ached more these days, and her hands, though steady, were the faint tremor of time. But her routine was unchanged. She arrived before the sun, took the service elevator to the 4th floor, and began the same careful path she had followed for over a decade. She wasn't invisible, but she was easy to miss. That morning, she wore her usual blue work smock and white sneakers softened by years of wear. And tucked into the inside pocket of her apron, right over her heart, was a worn, folded photograph. She reached for it now with quiet hands. Michael. The image was faded, but his face still beamed back at her. A young man with bright eyes, a tangle of dark curls, and a half-smile that always looked like he was about to explain something you didn't know yet. She whispered to the picture as she worked. "I'm doing it today, Mikey. I really am. I don't know if it'll matter, but I'm doing it." Her voice trembled, not with doubt, but with the weight of remembering. 10 years had passed since her son lost his battle with leukemia. And yet, every day she worked these halls, she felt him walking just a few steps behind her. Every corner of this building reminded her of him, not because he had ever been there, but because it was the kind of place he should have belonged to. Michael had dreamed of working for Elon Musk since he was a boy. He had written letters, built mock rockets out of scrap PVC pipe, drawn pages upon pages of propulsion systems no one had ever taught him to design. Helen had saved all of it, every diagram, every scribbled idea, every piece of notebook paper with burn marks from late-night experiments in their garage. That morning, as she approached the executive suite, her steps grew slower. Elon's office would be empty until the afternoon. She had cleaned it many times, always with quiet care, never touching anything she wasn't meant to, never letting herself imagine too much. But today was different. In her cleaning cart, beneath a folded dish towel, rested Michael's old sketchbook. Leather-bound, weathered, with pages filled not just with concepts, but with questions only someone brave enough to dream alone would ask. She hadn't planned this moment. Not really, but something in her had shifted recently. Maybe it was the ache in her knees. Maybe it was the silence of her small apartment at night. Maybe it was the soft voice in her dreams telling her that time was no longer something to borrow. She stood inside the office now, her gaze sweeping the polished desk, the shelves lined with thick engineering volumes, the windows opening out to a Texas sky that looked ready to speak. Her hands reached for the sketchbook. She unwrapped it gently, her fingertips brushing over the cracked leather. The corners were frayed. The cover still carried a faint oil stain from the time Michael had spilled soup on it while sketching thrust differentials between spoonfuls. She smiled. Then, slowly, she crossed the room. Between two books, Reusable Launch Vehicle Design and Propulsion Advances of the 21st Century, she slid Michael's notebook onto the shelf. It nestled there, unassuming, quiet. Just before stepping away, she taped a note to the cover. Her handwriting was neat, almost formal. She had practiced it 3 times at home on scrap paper, never sure if she would be brave enough to leave it. If you have a minute, this was my boy's dream. Nothing more. No plea, no demand, no explanation. Just one line of love folded in on itself. As she turned back toward the hallway, she hesitated once more, her eyes lingering on the notebook. Then she picked up her cart and stepped into the corridor. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding. Helen entered. The doors closed behind her without a sound. She didn't look back, but someone did. Down the hallway, near the corner where the security monitors were installed, a guard stood watching. He didn't stop her, didn't speak, just tilted his head slightly, as if sensing something important had just happened, but not quite knowing what. Above the building, clouds began to gather slowly, the sky shifting in tone. Not stormy, just full, like something in the world had turned quietly. Back in the office, the sketchbook sat on the shelf, still, waiting. A whisper left between floors, a mother's promise, a son's dream, and the possibility that someone might open it, not with their hands, but with their heart. Elon Musk couldn't shake the name. Michael. It was written in the margins of the pages, sometimes boldly, sometimes shyly, just that single name, as though the rest of the world didn't need to know anything more. But he needed to know. The sketchbook had haunted him all day. Between calls, meetings, and engineering updates, he kept returning to it mentally, flipping through its pages again in his mind. Those designs weren't drawn from books. They were born from hunger, from solitude, from someone who had no mentors, no lab, no team, but who had dared to dream anyway. So he called in his assistant. "Find out who left that notebook in my office," he said quietly, without looking up from the page he'd been studying. There was a note taped to it, handwritten. The team ran security footage, and the image was clear. An elderly woman in a pale blue uniform, with white sneakers and silver gray hair tied back, gently placing the sketchbook on the shelf. She hesitated before leaving, as if saying goodbye to something sacred. One of the guards recognized her. "That's Helen. She's been with the cleaning staff for years. Keeps to herself. Sweet lady. Never misses a day." Elon frowned. "How long has she worked here?" 11 years, sir. Since we opened this wing." 11 years. That meant she'd been walking these halls, sweeping floors, emptying bins, polishing doorknobs, while carrying that notebook in her heart, waiting for the right moment, or maybe just hoping one might arrive. They dug a little deeper. No one on staff knew much about her. She was kind, quiet, always early, never spoke of family, never asked for anything. But the name had been written over and over again in the notebook. Michael. Her son. Elon made his decision without hesitation. "I want to meet her. Tonight." It was past 10 when he returned to the building. The halls were mostly empty now, humming with silence. The overhead lights were dimmed to their evening setting, and the soft whir of cleaning carts echoed faintly from a far corridor. He found her near the west wing, mop in hand, wiping down the baseboards with a patience that belonged to another era. She didn't hear him approach. "Excuse me, are you Helen?" She startled so visibly he instinctively stepped back. The mop handle slipped from her hands and nearly clattered to the floor. She caught it mid-fall, her breath caught in her throat. Yes," she said, steadying herself. "Yes, I'm Helen." He offered a gentle smile. "I didn't mean to scare you." She blinked at him. Her eyes widened, not from recognition, but from disbelief. It was clear she hadn't expected him, not ever, to be standing in front of her. "You left something in my office," he said softly. "A notebook, with a message." Helen's hands gripped the mop handle tighter. "I'm sorry if I wasn't supposed to," she whispered. I didn't know how else to." He raised a hand gently. "No need to apologize. I wanted to thank you." She stared at him, unsure what to say. "Michael," he continued, "was he your son?" Helen's breath caught again. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She simply nodded, once then again, more slowly. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't have time to wipe away. "He was. Elon's voice dropped to something closer to reverence. "He drew those designs." She nodded again. "Every one." "I'd like to know more," he said, "if you're willing." She hesitated. Her instinct was to retreat, to return to the safety of her silence, her mop, her solitude. But something in his eyes made her pause. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking for understanding. She nodded again. "There's a bench in the waiting area, just around the corner. It's quiet there." They sat side by side on the worn gray bench, surrounded by nothing but the hush of nighttime fluorescent lights and the distant hum of the janitorial closet's motor. It felt like a world apart from the sleek brilliance of mission control, but more honest somehow. Helen sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her back was straight, as if out of respect for the moment or for the boy she was about to speak of. "He was always building things," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Even before he could read properly. He used to take apart my radio just to see if he could put it back together." Elon listened without interruption. "He didn't have much," she said. "I raised him alone. We couldn't afford tutors or computers or special schools. But he read everything. Learned from books he found at the library, online articles, even old science magazines people threw away." Her voice grew steadier as the memories poured out. "He used to tape your interviews on VHS, Mr. Musk. Played them over and over again until the tape wore out. He'd say, 'Mom, this man thinks like I do. Someday, I'll work with him.'" She laughed softly, but there was sorrow in it. "He got sick just after he turned 23. We thought it was a virus at first, but it wasn't. It was leukemia. Aggressive. The kind that doesn't wait." She paused, swallowing hard. "But even in the hospital, he drew. He sketched until the 4 drips made his hands too weak to hold the pencil. And then he dictated, and I wrote for him. That notebook, it was all he left behind." A long silence settled between them. Elon looked down at his hands, then at her. "I think he was a genius," he said quietly. "I've never seen ideas like his. Not from anyone that young. Not without training." Helen didn't answer right away. When she did, it was soft. He didn't need training. He needed a chance. The words landed like a stone dropped gently into still water. "I don't know what made me bring the notebook," she said. "I almost didn't. I told myself it was silly, that no one would notice. But I did," Elon said, "and I'm very glad you did." They sat for a while longer, in silence, each one lost in a different kind of awe. For Elon, it was the quiet, staggering realization that genius can bloom anywhere, even in a dimly lit kitchen or the corners of a tired janitor's home. For Helen, it was the quiet comfort of knowing someone had finally seen her boy, not just the pages he left behind, but the mind that shaped them. The name Michael, once scribbled in pencil, had begun to echo through the walls of the very place he once dreamed of. And that night, in a hallway most would pass without a glance, something sacred had been exchanged, not with grandeur or headlines, but with eye contact and stillness. A boy's dream, a mother's promise, and a moment where the world paused just long enough to listen. He came into the world too early. Helen's voice was soft now, almost like she was remembering a lullaby. 11 weeks premature, less than 4 pounds. The doctors said he might not make it through the night. But I looked at him, and I saw a fight in those eyes that never left. They were still seated on the bench outside the executive wing, the quiet of the hallway wrapped around them, like a hush in a chapel. Elon hadn't spoken in several minutes. He didn't need to. Helen's story held the room. "Michael was curious about everything," she said, her hands folded in her lap, eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the walls. At 3, he was taking apart the radio. Not to break it, just to see how the voice got inside. He'd lay the screws in neat little rows and put them all back together again. She smiled faintly. "Once, I came home from work and found my hairdryer connected to wheels from a toy truck. He was trying to build a motorized fan car. Melted the carpet. Nearly burned his eyebrows off." Elon's lips twitched with the beginning of a smile, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "When he was 8, she said, he built his first rocket. A soda bottle, vinegar, and baking soda. Shot straight into the neighbor's yard. He screamed with joy, arms in the air like he'd just landed on Mars. Helen closed her eyes, just for a moment. He used to cut out every newspaper article with your name on it, tape it to the inside of his closet door, had a folder labeled Elon's Projects. Said one day he'd work for you. Elon's throat tightened, but he swallowed it back. He didn't have much, she said. We didn't. I cleaned houses during the day, folded laundry at a motel at night. There was no computer, no internet at home. So he went to the library, sat on the floor for hours, reading everything he could find. He taught himself calculus at 13. Not perfectly, but enough to start sketching propulsion models on the back of his school tests. She paused, blinking. Her eyes shimmered now, but her voice held steady. He wanted to apply to MIT, say it was the only place that would understand the way he thought. We saved every penny. I took in sewing work, mended uniforms for hotel staff. Sometimes he'd help me late at night, tracing chalk lines onto cloth. Elon imagined the scene. A boy with dreams bigger than his zip code, bending over fabric, whispering rocket equations to himself. He got in, Helen said. Well, halfway. They offered him a partial scholarship, but we couldn't cover the rest. He didn't tell me right away. I only found out when I saw him tearing up the acceptance letter at the kitchen table. She drew in a slow breath. I was sick that year. Nothing serious, just enough that I couldn't work double shifts anymore. He stayed, took a job fixing lawnmowers at a repair shop, said MIT could wait. Elon closed his eyes, but it didn't stop him. He built a lab in the basement, used scrap metal, PVC pipes, cast-off electronics from junkyards. I'd hear him soldering at 2 in the morning. When I told him to sleep, he'd laugh and say, "I'll sleep when my rocket's in orbit." She laughed now, too. A single, soft sound full of memory. I was afraid he'd give up, but he never did. He kept drawing, building. Some nights he'd show me sketches and say, "Do you think this would impress Elon?" Always with that same glint in his eye. Her smile faded. He got sick at 34. Just a fever at first. Then the bruises wouldn't go away. They called it acute leukemia. He was gone in less than a year. Elon finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "I'm so sorry." Helen nodded slowly, the silence stretching between them like a thread, fragile but strong. He spent his last days with a pencil in his hand. The nurses said he'd ask for paper before pain medication. When he couldn't hold the pencil anymore, he dictated. And I wrote, page after page. That notebook you found? That's what's left of those nights. She looked down at her hands. They were still, folded in her lap, as if holding something unseen. The day before he passed, she said, he called me over. His voice was faint, but his eyes were so clear. He handed me the notebook and said, "Mom, show this to Elon. One day, just in case he ever wants to know what a poor boy with no degree believed was possible." She paused, and I said I would. I promised. I kept it with me all this time waiting, always afraid I'd miss the chance. But I had to try. A silence settled over the hallway again. This time it wasn't heavy, it was sacred. Elon turned his head, looked directly at her. "You didn't miss anything," he said quietly. "You were right on time." Helen looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time since they sat down, her shoulders relaxed. Not because the grief had gone, but because the promise had been fulfilled. They both sat in silence, and for that one moment, time folded in on itself. A boy who had once dreamed in the shadows of his mother's hands was now speaking, louder than ever, through sketches, formulas, and the courage of a quiet woman who refused to let him be forgotten. And in that silence, a name once written in pencil began to carve itself gently, but permanently, into the future. Helen was polishing the brass trim near the east elevator when the receptionist found her. The young woman, barely 30, in sleek corporate black, spoke with quiet deference. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you Helen?" Helen straightened, instinctively brushing a loose strand of silver hair from her forehead. "Yes." There's a visitor badge waiting for you at the front desk. Special clearance. You've been invited to the engineering level." Helen blinked. There must be a mistake. The receptionist shook her head. "Mr. Musk asked for you personally." A pause stretched in the air. In her 11 years cleaning these halls, Helen had never once stepped beyond the service areas. She didn't even know where the elevators went above the second floor. Her badge had never allowed it, and she never asked. Now suddenly a door had opened, and behind it, her son's name was waiting. At the reception counter, a small envelope with her name written in looping cursive contained a white plastic badge. Temporary access, Level 4, Advanced Engineering Lab. She turned it over in her hand like a foreign object. Her hands, calloused and practiced, had never held anything like it. Before she could protest, a driver in a company vehicle arrived to escort her across campus. Helen stepped inside the clean black car, folding her hands tightly in her lap. Her work shoes looked so out of place against the leather. The ride was silent. The sky outside was washed in pale morning light, but Helen didn't see it. Her thoughts had pulled inward. She clutched her worn linen handkerchief and murmured something softly, perhaps a prayer or maybe just her son's name. The doors of the engineering building slid open with a quiet hiss. Inside, the air was different, sharper, full of code, calculation, and silent ambition. Young men and women in denim and black-rimmed glasses turned their heads as Helen entered. Some paused mid-conversation. Others simply watched. But no one sneered. No one questioned her. They looked at her the way one might look at a monument unexpectedly placed in the middle of a city, unfamiliar but oddly welcome. A young woman guided her into a large conference room with glass walls and a long, polished table. On it were papers, dozens of them, photocopies of sketches she knew by heart. Michael's handwriting danced across them, familiar as her own. Helen stopped in the doorway. She felt like she was intruding on a sacred ritual. And then Elon Musk stood and crossed the room. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a plain dark sweater and slacks, but he moved with that quiet command that made people straighten their backs. He reached out his hand gently. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "we're honored to have you here." Helen hesitated only a second before taking it. His grip was warm and steady. He gestured to the seat at the end of the table. "Please, join us." She lowered herself carefully into the chair, her back straight, hands folded tightly around her handkerchief. She didn't speak, didn't trust her voice yet. Around the table, engineers of all ages were gathered. Not one of them looked at her like a janitor. They looked at her like someone who had brought them something rare, something they'd been searching for without knowing it. One of the younger men, tall, with tousled hair and ink-stained fingers, spoke first. "We've been reviewing your son's designs," he said, tapping the papers. "And it's incredible. Michael saw something before the rest of us. Way before." Helen's breath caught. He proposed a hybrid system that merges onboard regenerative energy capture with auxiliary fuel, recycling mid-flight. It's rudimentary, but the concept is solid. Another engineer chimed in. "No one's published anything this specific yet. If we validate it, this could change high-altitude recovery and deep-stage flight systems entirely." Elon leaned forward, hands clasped together. "We're not just impressed. We're moved. This wasn't theory on a chalkboard. This was vision. Clear, disciplined, imaginative." Helen's eyes never left the sketches. She could see it all again. Michael hunched over the kitchen table, erasing with the side of his hand, redrawing lines until his pencil was no more than a stub. She spoke at last. "He worked in our basement, made prototypes with coat hangers and PVC pipes. We couldn't afford anything better, but he never asked for more." Her voice cracked gently. "He just believed." There was a stillness in the room, a respectful quiet. One of the older engineers adjusted his glasses. "Do you know how rare it is to see this kind of clarity in a mind that had no formal training?" Helen gave the smallest nod. He was always like that, since he was a child. Elon stood. "We've started internal review to see how far this can go. If it holds, we'll file a patent on the system, and we'll name it after him." He paused, letting the words settle like dust in the morning light. "We'll call it the Michael Carter Drive." Helen didn't move at first. She simply looked down at her hands. The same hands that had folded laundry for decades, that had packed sandwiches, bandaged knees, scrubbed countertops. The hands that had held her son through fever and fear. Now those same hands trembled around a handkerchief as quiet tears welled in her eyes. No one rushed her. No one filled the silence. It was as if the entire building had bowed its head. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a breath. "Thank you." Outside, the world went on. But in that room, for one extraordinary moment, the boundaries of time and title, of science and sorrow, disappeared. And a mother who had once held her son's final notebook like a relic too sacred for daylight, now watched it spread, line by line, into the hands of those who could carry it forward. Michael had spoken through ink and pencil, through wires and doubt. And now, finally, the world was listening. The apartment was silent when Helen walked in. She set her purse down, unzipped her coat, and stood for a moment by the door, still and unmoving, as if the air inside needed a moment to remember her. Everything in her home was exactly as she had left it, neat, clean, worn in, with love. The small television beside the window blinked its red standby light. A half-read devotional lay open on the arm of the recliner. The scent of lavender hung faintly in the air. But today, something was different. Or maybe she was. She crossed the room with slow steps, walked past the kitchen table where Michael once sketched formulas beside his plate of toast, and reached for the small wooden shelf in the corner of the living room. Her fingers brushed gently over a simple picture frame. The photo inside was one she had dusted 1,000 times before. Michael, age 15, standing in the driveway holding a crude rocket made from PVC pipes and aluminum foil. His curls were messy, his face smudged with grease, but his eyes, those eyes burned with belief. Helen held the frame against her chest. "They saw it, son," she whispered, voice trembling. "They saw what you built. They understood." She sat slowly on the edge of the couch, still cradling the picture. The quiet of the room wrapped around her like a shawl. For a long time, she didn't move. Her thoughts wandered back to the basement stairs, to the sound of Michael coughing late into the night, and how she would stand at the top, hand over her mouth, heart breaking with every rasp. But he always insisted he was fine. "I'm on the verge of something, Mom," he would say, eyes gleaming through the fatigue. "Just let me finish this page." He always said it like time would wait for him. Now that same sketchbook, creased, loved, smudged with memory, was no longer just in her home. It had been scanned, studied, and shared among some of the brightest minds in the world. His formulas were in conference rooms. His diagrams hung on glass boards. His name had begun to appear, quietly, reverently, on lips that had never known him. It was more than Helen had dared to hope. That morning, an envelope had arrived. Inside was a formal letter from the engineering team at SpaceX. Typed neatly on company letterhead, it was warm, personal, and ended with the words, "We are honored to carry forward Michael's vision. Thank you for sharing him with us." Alongside the letter was a small velvet box. Helen opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a discreet round brooch, silver, elegant, and engraved with just 3 words. Inspiration, Michael H. She traced the lettering with the tip of her finger. Not a title, not a technical designation, just a truth. Inspiration. Her eyes welled with tears, but for the first time in years, they weren't from sorrow. This was something else entirely. It was release. A slow exhale after a decade of holding everything in. She wept there quietly, picture in hand, the brooch in her lap, the space around her soft with peace. Meanwhile, at the SpaceX facility, the buzz had changed. In engineering meetings, whiteboards filled with Michael's hybrid propulsion sketches. Teams circled around simulation models, running calculations, and testing concepts born in the mind of a boy who had worked alone in a basement. One engineer said softly he was ahead of his time. Another added, or maybe we're just behind. The name Michael began to circulate, first in memos, then in voice notes, then in a project document labeled MC HYB01. There was no announcement, no ceremony, but something sacred was growing. Elon Musk watched it unfold with silent respect. In a closed-door meeting with senior engineers, he stood and said, "This is not just about a propulsion model. It's not just about solving a technical problem." He paused, then added, "It's about a promise a mother made. And we're not just fulfilling it, we're honoring it." Every head in the room nodded. A week later, Helen returned to the facility. This time, she wasn't wearing her janitor's uniform. She wore her best sweater, a navy knit she'd saved for special occasions, and a soft gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Pinned to the edge was the brooch, catching the light with quiet dignity. She was led through the upper corridors, places she had only passed from a distance, and brought into a lab marked Propulsion Randy. When the doors opened, she stopped in her tracks. On one wall, behind a sheet of glass, hung 3 enlarged prints of Michael's sketches. The paper edges had been preserved, the pencil strokes darkened, the notations visible exactly as they had been in his hand. Beneath each drawing was a bronze plaque with a single word, Michael. In the corner of the room, on a pedestal, a candle flickered gently. Not grand, just simple, steady, a gesture of presence. Helen stepped forward, hand lightly pressed to her chest. She approached the glass and slowly raised one hand, placing her fingers against the surface. "You're here, my boy," she whispered. The engineers gave her space. No one interrupted. No one rushed her. To them, she was not a visitor. She was the origin of everything in that room. What Michael had written in pencil was now living in circuitry and code. What Helen had once tucked away in a drawer was now expanding into something the world might soon see in the sky. And though the boy was gone, the dream remained. Because love, when carried faithfully, becomes something more than memory. It becomes motion. And some ideas, like the boy who dreamed them, don't die. They lift, they launch, they endure. The first time Helen returned to SpaceX after the lab visit, she wore the same gray shawl, this time with the silver brooch proudly fastened at the shoulder. It wasn't a tour, and she wasn't there to clean. She had been invited. Once a week, every Wednesday morning, a car now arrived to pick her up from her apartment. She rode quietly to the engineering campus, holding a thermos of tea in her lap and a notebook Elon's assistant had given her, blank pages, gently lined, with a soft leather cover and the initials HC embossed in the corner. Inside the building, something had shifted. Helen was no longer an unseen figure pushing a mop cart through quiet corridors. Now, engineers nodded to her in the hallways. Young interns stood a little straighter when she walked into a room. In the propulsion wing, a chair was always left open at the table, hers. She never claimed to belong there. She brought no equations. She didn't know the names of the parts or the formulas that hummed on the white boards. But she listened, carefully, kindly, and when she asked a question, it made people think. On her third visit, a young engineer named Matteo approached her after a meeting. He was tall, wiry, with calloused fingers and tired eyes. "Mrs. Carter," he said, hesitating slightly, "I just wanted to say, your son reminds me of me. Or maybe the me I was supposed to be." Helen looked up at him gently. "Do you build at home too?" He nodded. "In my garage. My mom used to sweep hair at a salon. She saved up for my first soldering kit." There was something in the way his voice cracked on the word mom that made Helen reach out and touch his arm. "You tell her she raised a good man," she said. "Michael would have liked you." Later that day, in a quiet corner of the executive floor, Elon brought up an idea. He stood with his arms crossed, looking out over the launch field as Helen sat on a bench in the corridor, sipping her tea. "What if we created a scholarship?" he said. Helen looked up. "In Michael's name," he added, "for kids like him. Smart, driven, maybe overlooked. The ones who build with tape and scrap wood and dreams bigger than their zip code." Helen sat silently, the cup trembling slightly in her hand. "I don't know," she said. "That's a big thing. I'm just..." She couldn't quite finish the sentence. Just what? A mother? A widow? A former janitor? A woman who'd spent more time folding linens than reading aerospace theory? But then she heard Michael's voice in her mind, clear as sunlight through a dusty window. Knowledge needs wings, Mom. If it's going to change anything, it has to be able to fly. She looked up at Elon. Let's give them wings. The paperwork arrived a week later. Legal terms, foundations, endowments, application criteria. Helen didn't understand all of it, but she read every page with care, underlining words that mattered to her: access, invention, encouragement, resilience. The scholarship would be named the Michael Carter Fellowship for Emerging Inventors. She signed the final form with a trembling hand, then placed the pen down slowly, like completing a quiet ritual. The next chapter had begun. Helen didn't stop there. With the encouragement of the SpaceX team, she began visiting local science fairs, first as a guest, then as a speaker. At first, she was nervous. What could she possibly say that mattered? But then she started talking about Michael, about the vinegar and baking soda rockets, about the garage full of parts, about the ideas scribbled in spiral notebooks under flickering lights. She didn't speak like an expert. She spoke like a mother who had seen the price of persistence. And that was more than enough. Kids listened. One Saturday afternoon, at a modest school gymnasium filled with cardboard trifold displays and science kits made from cereal boxes, a little girl approached Helen with wide eyes. She wore thick glasses and held a sketchbook under her arm. "My name's Brianna," the girl whispered. "I want to be like your son." Helen knelt slowly to her level. Her knees ached, but her heart did not. "You already are," she said softly. "You're dreaming something real. That's where it begins." The girl threw her arms around her, and for a moment, Helen could hardly breathe. Not from pain, but from wonder. From the impossible, unthinkable truth that somehow her son had become a spark in someone else's sky. Back at SpaceX, changes continued quietly. The room that had first displayed Michael's sketches had been formally renamed. A small bronze plaque now hung by the door, the Michael Room. Inside, the original diagrams remained on the wall, protected behind museum-grade glass. Engineers would pass through, pointing out his annotations, studying the evolution of a thought. Sometimes, late at night, they would light the candle in the corner. Not because they were told to, but because it felt right. Helen still wore her janitor shoes most days, white, creased, comfortable. She didn't need new ones. She didn't want new ones. They reminded her of where she'd walked, of what she had once carried without anyone knowing. But now, she walked differently. She moved not with grief, but with quiet purpose. With hands that had once scrubbed floors, now signing letters of acceptance. With a voice that had once gone unnoticed, now lifting others. And though Michael was no longer beside her, his spirit filled every hallway she walked, every sketch she encouraged, every dream she helped unlock. She thought she had lost everything, but in giving his dream to the world, she found something unexpected. A new reason to stay, a second life, a purpose that would never grow old. The school hadn't changed much. It still stood on the quiet corner of Maple and Birch, its bricks faded but sturdy, windows smudged with the fingerprints of decades of curious children. The flag out front swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the faint sound of a bell echoed down the hallway as Helen stepped through the front doors for the first time in over 20 years. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the tiled floor, the lockers still painted a hopeful sky blue. Time had worn everything, but not unkindly. The school was modest, its walls still lined with handmade posters, handprints from our class, and faded photographs of sports teams and spelling bee champions. It smelled of old paper, pencil shavings, and something faintly sweet, just as it had when Michael used to race through these halls with his shoelaces always untied. A woman from the front office led her down the corridor to the science wing. Helen walked past room 14, where Michael had once built a miniature solar panel for the county fair. Past the trophy case, where his name was still etched into a bronze plaque for Outstanding Science Achievement Grade 7. The memories felt close. Not haunting, just tender. Like the echo of a song you once knew by heart. Inside the classroom, a man stood beside a cluttered lab bench, sorting through bins of circuit boards and wires. He looked up when Helen entered. His face, lined with age and softened with years of teaching, lit up instantly. "Helen Carter," he said, voice catching in his throat. "You haven't changed a bit." She laughed gently. "That's a lie, George, and we both know it." Mr. Beasley had been Michael's science teacher. He was the first adult outside of Helen who truly saw what the boy could become. "I brought something," Helen said, reaching into her canvas bag. She pulled out a clear folder containing full-color copies of Michael's original sketches. She handed them to him without ceremony, but her hands trembled slightly. Mr. Beasley took them carefully, as if they were ancient artifacts. His eyes scanned the pages, lingering on the fine pencil lines, the margin notes, the loops in Michael's handwriting. "He really never stopped drawing," he murmured. "I always knew he'd go far." Even when he sat at the back of the class, muttering to himself about fuel ratios. He closed the folder slowly and looked up, eyes glassy. There was something in him. A light. It wasn't just talent. It was purpose. That boy was building toward something. Helen nodded. He still is. Within a month, the school had transformed. With support from SpaceX and a few quiet benefactors, a new robotics lab was being installed. It wasn't grand, nothing polished or corporate, but it was real. There were 3D printers, a corner for soldering stations, and shelves lined with donated laptops and microcontrollers. Above the doorway, painted in bold letters, was the name: the Michael Carter Innovation Lab. In the hallway outside, a mural had been unveiled, a sweeping image of a rocket launching into a sky made of stars that gradually transformed into equations and blueprints. At the center was a portrait of Michael, drawn from a photo Helen had provided. He was young, his eyes shining with the same spark that had once filled her small kitchen at night. At the dedication assembly, the cafeteria had been turned into a gathering hall. Folding chairs were packed with students and staff. The air buzzed with the energy of something meaningful. Helen sat near the front, in her favorite navy sweater, the silver brooch pinned just over her heart. Her hands rested in her lap, one atop the other, calm and folded. A student stepped up to the microphone, a teenage girl with dark braids and a voice steadier than her years. She read aloud from a piece of lined notebook paper. "When someone you love dies, they don't disappear," she said. "They wait, not in the past, but in what we carry forward. It's not death that takes them. It's forgetting." Helen pressed a hand to her chest. Something inside her, something knotted and silent for so long, began to gently loosen. Back at SpaceX, Michael's ideas had taken root in a different way. In the propulsion lab, after months of study, simulation, and modification, the engineers had constructed a working prototype based on his original design. The hybrid model, the one that captured excess energy and redirected thrust, was now mounted in a controlled test chamber. They called it the H-Drive. Not officially, not yet, but in every meeting, every log entry, every whispered conversation over lunch, that's what it had become. "Power on," an engineer called out. Helen stood beside Elon Musk in the observation booth as the engine flared to life. She wore protective headphones, but her eyes were fixed not on the noise or the numbers, but on the slow, steady vibration of the machine that carried her son's signature in every bolt and curve. The sound was sharp, clean, roaring with controlled force. It wasn't just mechanical, it was alive. A burst of motion, carrying with it all the quiet hours spent in the basement of her old house. Every late night, every notebook page. Next to her, one of the engineers turned. "He believed in this before we did," he said, almost in awe. Helen didn't look away from the engine. "He never waited for the world to be fair," she said. "He just wanted to give it something better." And in that chamber, filled with sound and light, something once lost had come home. Some legacies are carved in stone. Others are written in pencil, and then carried page by page into a future they helped build. Michael Carter, never stepped into the halls of MIT. He never wore a lab coat in a glossy research facility. But now, his voice echoed in classrooms. His vision lit the sky. And through his mother's hands, the world had finally opened its doors. The cemetery had not changed. Same winding path. Same creaking gate that moaned softly as it opened. Same canopy of trees overhead, their leaves whispering secrets only the wind could understand. Helen walked slowly, her feet crunching on the gravel, a small velvet box held gently in her hand. It was early, too early for most visitors, but she had always preferred the quiet hours when the world still seemed to remember how to listen. Row by row, she passed the names etched into stone. Names she had come to know over the years. Some familiar, some strangers, but all resting side by side in the stillness of time. She reached Michael's grave and paused. The marker was simple, just his name, the years of his birth and death, and a line she had chosen long ago. He dreamed upward. No marble angels, no elaborate inscriptions. Michael wouldn't have wanted that. What mattered to him had never been about attention. It had always been about movement, about building something greater than himself. She knelt slowly, her joints stiff with age, but steady. She opened the box. Inside, gleaming softly in the morning light, was a replica of the brooch given to her by the SpaceX team, this one bearing a tiny engraved version of the new propulsion system's symbol, the H drive. It had taken months to develop, but it was now being tested, improved, refined. It carried her son's original concept at its heart. Helen pressed her fingers to the stone. "Now it's yours," she said softly, placing the brooch against the cool granite. Not just the dream, the name, the work. It's yours, Michael. For real now. A breeze stirred the trees, and for a long moment, their branches swayed in unison, like reverence or memory or something older still. She sat on the old wooden bench beside his grave, the one she had chosen and installed herself after his passing. The wood had grayed with age, and one of the legs wobbled slightly, but still held her. It always did. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a letter. The envelope was soft with wear, corners folded, the flap never sealed. Inside, in a slanted, fading hand, were Michael's final words to her. Not spoken, but written, perhaps on a day when he felt time tightening its grip. "Mine, if you ever manage to find him, show him. Show him what I saw, what I believe can be done. I know it might never happen, but I also know you and how you carry things quietly. Maybe too quietly. I hope one day you speak for me. Because if I never get to, at least you'll know I tried. Thank you for every night you stayed up sewing while I scribbled next to you. You were always the reason." She pressed the letter to her chest. She didn't cry. Not this time. The tears had already fallen. On birthdays, on holidays, on silent mornings when the ache felt louder than life. But today, there was something different. A fullness. Not joy exactly, but a peace earned through sorrow. The promise had been kept. At the SpaceX headquarters, in a room filled with dimmed lights and rows of folding chairs, a video began to play. It was the opening session of the International Young Scientists Summit, an event that welcomed over 1,000 teenage inventors, dreamers, and engineers from across the country. The screen flickered to life with the image of a young boy's sketchbook, weathered, pencil-lined, full of curious loops and bold diagrams. A voice narrated, "This is Michael Carter. He never got a degree, never had a lab, but he saw something before the rest of us did, and he believed in it enough to keep drawing, even when no one was watching." The video moved through time. Black and white photos of Michael as a boy holding up toy rockets. Footage of the H drive in early testing. A quiet shot of Helen, standing in the SpaceX lab, touching the glass where his sketches now hung. Then came the picture that made the entire room hold its breath. Helen, 20 years younger, standing in front of a garage with Michael, both of them laughing, wind in their hair, grease on his hands. The audience, filled with teenagers who'd once doubted if they belonged, sat in complete silence. After the presentation, dozens of students came forward to write letters. They were placed in a box marked to Mrs. Helen Carter. Some were brief. Others were pages long. One said, "I've never met you, but I think of you now when I open my notebook." Another wrote, "He was just like me. Thank you for sharing him." When Helen received the package a week later, she read every single one, some aloud to herself, some in whispers late at night. They became a kind of music, a low hum of gratitude that reminded her she had not spoken into the void. One afternoon, during an interview with a local science journal, a reporter asked her gently, "Mrs. Carter, did you ever imagine you'd be doing all this at 72? Helen smiled, the kind of smile that carries both pride and disbelief. "No," she said truthfully. "I thought my time had passed. I thought my usefulness ended the day I lost him." She paused. "But now I know," she added, voice growing steadier, "the love a mother gives doesn't expire. It doesn't grow old. It doesn't end. It waits, sometimes for years. And then one day, it finds a way to bloom again." Some things Helen now understood don't belong to time. They live in notebooks, in unfinished letters, in the quiet faith that someone someday will understand. And when they finally do, the whole world takes one step forward. Because someone believed, even in silence, even alone, they had waited months for this day. Years, if you counted the time stored quietly in the creases of an old notebook. Decades, if you counted a mother's patience. Helen stood just outside the security checkpoint of a SpaceX launch operations center, dressed in a soft navy blue blazer over a pearl-colored blouse and a charcoal gray skirt that brushed against her calves. Her shoes were low-heeled, polished but modest. Around her neck, the silver brooch glittered gently in the morning light. The engraved symbol of the propulsion system, the H drive, rested just above her heart. A staff member approached and offered her a guest badge, already clipped with a small satin ribbon that read, "Honored Guest, Helen Carter." She smiled politely, thanked the woman, and stepped into the building. Inside, dozens of employees moved about with focused energy. But when Helen entered the main hallway, they paused. Not abruptly, not loudly, just enough to acknowledge her presence. A few straightened their postures. One or two smiled quietly and gave her a nod. Then a soft wave of applause rose, gentle and restrained but sincere. Helen blinked in surprise, her hand instinctively touching her collarbone. Elon Musk emerged from a nearby room. He wasn't in a suit, but rather in his usual dark jeans and fitted black shirt, rolled at the sleeves. His presence was, as always, composed but intense. Yet today, there was something different in his eyes, something softer. "Mrs. Carter," he said, stepping forward, "would you walk with me?" She gave a small nod, her hand still holding the handkerchief she hadn't yet unfolded. They walked in silence through the corridor that led to the command viewing gallery, a long room with tiered seating, panoramic glass walls, and a giant screen that filled the far end of the space. In the center of that screen, the rocket. It stood tall on the launch pad at a distant site in New Mexico. A sleek body of steel and flame readiness, fitted with the hybrid propulsion unit derived from Michael's original sketches. The sun hadn't yet risen at the launch site, so the sky behind it was painted in hues of deep indigo and silver twilight. Helen sat in the front row, flanked by Elon on one side and several lead engineers behind her. The room was quiet, except for the occasional soft buzz of systems coming online. A technician's voice came through the intercom. "Final systems check complete. Weather optimal. T-minus 2 minutes to ignition." Helen gripped the handkerchief in her lap. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from something deeper. A memory, a knowing, a culmination of something planted long ago finally blooming in skybound silence. The countdown began. 10, 9. She could hear Michael's voice in her mind. "This is the tricky part, Mom. Right here, between 10 and 5. That's when the engine breathes for the first time. 8, 7. She had been there when he built his first bottle rocket in the backyard using rubber bands and vinegar. The same spark, the same conviction. 6, 5. On the screen, the rocket held still, as if waiting for permission from the stars. 4, 3. Helen whispered beneath her breath, not even realizing she was doing it. Go, my love. Go. 2, 1. Ignition. The screen erupted in color and sound. The hybrid engine came to life with a resonance unlike anything she had ever heard. Not just loud, but deep. A living roar that carried memory and ambition in every vibration. The rocket lifted, not with violence, but with grace, steady, powerful, rising on a column of gold and smoke. The room held its breath. Helen's eyes filled, not quickly, but slowly, as if each tear was drawing from years of waiting. They rolled down her cheeks in silence. She didn't reach to stop them. Elon leaned in gently, his voice quiet and reverent. It was him. He brought us to this. Helen nodded, not taking her eyes off the screen. Outside, though they couldn't see it directly, the sky was turning honey-colored as the late afternoon sun dipped low. At the viewing platform outdoors, hundreds of employees and invited guests stood in collective awe. Many of them didn't know the full story behind the flight, but they felt something unspoken in the air. A kind of reverence, as if the launch was more than mechanical, as if it was personal. When the rocket passed through the clouds and vanished into the upper atmosphere, a gentle round of applause filled the room. It was not the thundering ovation of celebration, it was softer, grateful, as though clapping for someone who couldn't be there, but very much was. Helen stood. She walked slowly to the glass, one hand pressed lightly against the surface. Somewhere beyond it, the rocket soared, carrying her son's dream farther than he had ever gone. She looked upward. Her voice was low but steady. You flew, my son. You finally flew. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the machines in the room seemed quieter. The launch was a success. The data would come in later, the charts, the numbers, the technical triumphs. But in that instant, none of it mattered more than what had just passed through the heart of a mother. She had carried a promise for so long, through pain and poverty, through hospital nights and quiet mornings of disbelief, through age and grief and time. And now, as the sky closed behind the rocket, she knew the world had made room for his voice, and in doing so, had made room for her own. That day, a rocket launched, but something else rose too, something not made of metal, but of memory. And it carried no weight, yet soared farther than anyone could measure. The letter arrived in a crisp envelope, thick with significance. Helen opened it slowly, carefully slipping the folded paper from its shell. Her hands, though steadier these days, still treated such things with reverence, as if the weight of memory was stitched into every crease. It was from SpaceX. The header bore the company seal in silver ink, elegant and reserved. But it was the words below that made her breath pause mid-chest. We are honored to inform you that the Hargrove Hybrid Propulsion System has been officially approved for integration into future low-orbit missions. The innovation, originally inspired by the early theoretical sketches of Michael Hargrove, will carry his name in all technical registries, documentation, and mission records. She sat down slowly, the paper resting in her lap. It was official. Michael's name would no longer be confined to a gravestone, a sketchbook, or the corners of her memory. It would orbit the Earth, fly among stars, be spoken aloud by engineers, printed in manuals, and whispered by dreamers who might never know him, but who would owe part of their ascent to his vision. Helen closed her eyes and whispered, he'd have laughed, said it still needed work. But there was more. 2 days later, a package arrived. Small, polished, weighted with thought. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a precise miniature replica of the rocket that had launched the H-Drive. Its surface gleamed like brushed silver. A nameplate at the base read, "To Helen Carter, with gratitude for carrying a universe in your heart." Beneath the model, on a cream-colored card, was Elon's handwriting. Some dreams don't need time, just courage. You gave him both. She touched the replica gently, then placed it on the mantel beside a familiar photograph. Michael at age 10, holding up a mess of wires and duct tape wings, grinning like he built the future from a cereal box. The two now sat side by side, past and present, Hope and proof. Word began to spread. First, it was a journalist from a science publication, then a local librarian organizing a youth club, then 2 high school girls from Lubbock who showed up at her apartment with homemade cookies and questions about propulsion theory. What they really wanted to hear wasn't about engineering. It was about Michael, about the silence he'd worked in, about the faith she'd carried when no one else had known to look, about what it felt like to wait decades for the world to catch up. And Helen spoke, not as a scientist, not even as a storyteller, but as a mother who had nothing left to hide. She shared the sound of his coughs from the basement, his stubborn refusal to rest, his childlike joy when something small finally functioned. She spoke of nights they'd eaten toast for dinner, of the day he gave up MIT to care for her, and of the final sketch he completed with a trembling hand in a hospital bed that smelled of antiseptic and lavender oil. Young people listened, sometimes through tears, sometimes with pencils scribbling furiously in the margins of cheap notebooks. What she gave them wasn't instruction, it was permission to dream imperfectly, to keep going. And then one morning, a second letter came. This one was from an observatory in Arizona. She read it twice before it truly settled. Dear Mrs. Carter, we are honored to inform you that a newly discovered asteroid in the outer asteroid belt has been officially registered with the International Astronomical Union under the name Michael Hargrove. Her heart swelled, slowly and deeply, like a tide rising without wind. He had once joked, quietly, shyly, that maybe he'd never leave Earth, but one day something with his name might. Now it had. At a small rural school on the edge of the Texas plains, Helen was seated in a foldable metal chair beneath a creaking ceiling fan. Children buzzed with curiosity after her talk. Their teacher, a woman named Miss Aguilar, had invited her to speak not just about rockets, but about what it means to believe in someone who's gone. After the applause faded, a little girl, no older than 8, came forward. Her braids were tied with faded ribbon. She held out a sketchbook with a rubber band around it. "This is for my dad," she whispered. He's not here anymore, but he liked to draw flying things too." Helen took the book carefully like a relic. She opened to the first page, crayon lines of clouds, wings, arrows pointing upward. Her voice caught, but she didn't let it break. "Then let's dream together," she said gently. That weekend, on the hill behind her apartment complex, where Michael once launched bottle rockets to the amazement of neighbors, Helen returned with a team from the local community center. They planted a young oak tree, strong roots, open sky. A simple wooden plaque rested at its base. For Michael, and for all who dared to dream alone, the tree of silence and science. She stood back, one hand on her heart. No crowd, no headlines. Just sunlight filtering through new leaves and the hush of wind through grass. It was enough. In the quiet of her living room that evening, the sky turned amber behind the curtains. The replica rocket caught the light just so, casting a glint across the frame of Michael's photo. Helen sat with a cup of tea in hand and whispered, "You're still flying, my son, and now you're leading others." And somewhere far above, past clouds and orbit, past sound and atmosphere, an asteroid spun slowly in the dark, a silent monument not just to one man's ideas, but to the unseen courage that carried them into the light. Some names are carved in stone, others are written in the sky. The cardboard box was worn at the corners and caved slightly at the top, its flaps softened by years of being opened, closed, and moved from closet to shelf and back again. It had no label. It didn't need one. Helen knew what was inside without even lifting the lid. She placed it gently on the coffee table and sat down slowly beside it. For a moment, she simply stared, hands folded on her lap, the light from the window falling in soft slants across the faded brown surface. Then, with a breath that felt like opening a door long shut, she removed the lid. Inside were loose pages, sketchbooks with bent corners, yellowed notebook paper filled with equations both wrong and right, scraps torn from cereal boxes where Michael had once diagrammed fuel ratios using a crayon. Among them were folded sticky notes with messy handwriting, the kind that trails off when thoughts move faster than ink. Some pages still bore the faint aroma of old graphite. Others smelled faintly of coffee, his favorite blend, dark and too strong for his age, which he used to sneak into the basement when working late. She picked up one page where the ink had smudged slightly in the corner. A familiar round stain marked the bottom left, coffee. She could still picture the chipped mug he always insisted on using, with a fading picture of the moon. Her fingers moved over the paper with care. Not as an archivist, but as a mother, touching not just objects but presence. Michael's presence. Every misplaced decimal, every crooked arrow, every ambitious scribble carried his breath, his hope. Beneath a stack of formulas, she found something more personal, a photograph. Michael, at around 7 years old, proudly wearing homemade goggles crafted from clear plastic lids and electrical tape, holding up a cardboard reactor painted silver with a brush that had clearly run dry halfway through. His teeth were missing in front, and he was grinning so wide it looked like he might burst with excitement. Helen's lips trembled, then curled. She chuckled softly, a low, warm sound that wrapped the room in a blanket of memory. Holding the photograph to her chest, she closed her eyes. She didn't cry, not this time. She rocked gently, as if cradling not just the memory, but a child newly born again in the folds of her heart. Later that week, she carefully selected a group of Michael's earliest sketches, the ones with thumbprints, misspellings, and curious side notes that made no technical sense but burned with possibility. She took them to the small science museum downtown, where she had once taken him to see his first model of a space capsule. The museum director, a tall woman named Clara, received the bundle like sacred scripture. Within a month, an exhibit was announced, Dreams Drawn by Hand, the early vision of Michael Hargrove. It wasn't just a tribute to the man he became. It was a window into the boy he had been, the boy who sketched futures no one yet believed in. On opening night, Helen stood near the entrance of the exhibition hall, wearing her Sunday best and clutching a printed program that trembled only slightly in her hand. Inside, the walls had been transformed into panels of stories, sketches, and photos. One wall held a life-size print of the page where Michael had first scribbled the earliest form of the H drive, complete with a red circle around a line that read, "Needs fuel recovery, don't give up." Children passed by wide-eyed. Parents lingered at the letters he'd written to himself, urging patience, courage, precision. Helen had not wanted to speak at the event. She was not a public woman. She had lived in hallways in silence. But when the museum offered her the podium, something inside her had whispered, "It's time." So she stepped forward when her name was called. The lights dimmed slightly. The audience hushed. Helen stood behind the microphone and looked out, not at a sea of strangers, but at faces that felt oddly familiar. Young ones full of hunger, older ones worn from trying, mothers, fathers, dreamers. She took a breath and said simply, "My son wasn't a genius. He was stubborn, curious, and he never let being ordinary stop him from trying something extraordinary." There was a silence at first, the kind that sinks in, not from discomfort, but from understanding. Then gently the applause began, not thunderous but full. Not just for the man Michael had been, but for the woman who had carried his light long after he was gone. Afterward, as guests mingled around the exhibit, Helen felt a soft tap on her arm. She turned to see a woman around her age, with silver streaks through her dark hair and tears welling in her eyes. Without a word, the woman reached out and embraced her. The hug was quiet, fierce, and full of unspoken things. When she finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "You gave me courage to remember my boy again. Thank you." Helen nodded. She understood. There were more mothers like her than the world dared to count. Women who carried promises, sketches, birthdays, empty chairs at Sunday dinner. Not every child flew into space, but every mother carried a sky inside her. At home that evening, Helen sat with her tea cooling beside her and the exhibition program open on her lap. She traced Michael's name on the cover with one finger. Love, she realized, does not vanish. It changes forms. It moves from arms to memories, from photographs to legacies, from loss to purpose. It finds new ways to live. And as long as she had breath, she would carry him forward, page by page, story by story, until even the stars knew who he had been. Because some memories don't fade. They burn quietly, warming the hands of those who reach for them. The letter arrived in a pale blue envelope, handwritten in an elegant, looping style. Helen opened it with care, her fingertips trembling slightly against the worn paper. Inside, a formal proposal, a documentary film about her and Michael, about the sketchbook, about everything. She read it twice, then left it on the table for days. Helen had never wanted cameras. She didn't seek attention. All she'd ever longed for was that someone, somewhere, might see her son's ideas and understand what they meant. Not for fame, not for applause, but because Michael had believed so fully, so purely, that his thoughts could help someone else fly. It wasn't until her second cup of tea on the fourth morning that she folded the letter and whispered, "Maybe someone else's mother needs to see this." She called the number, and so it began. The film crew arrived quietly, with more reverence than equipment. They were gentle, mostly young, and careful not to disturb the small things: the photo on the mantel, the worn blanket folded at the end of the couch, the ceramic angel perched on the bookshelf. They started at her house. Helen sat in her favorite chair, the box of Michael's sketches beside her, and spoke softly into the light. She talked not about rocket science, but about lunches skipped so he could buy more copper wire. About the time he soldered a wire to the kitchen faucet by mistake. About how, even in his hospital bed, he had asked her to help him reach his notebook. "I didn't raise a genius," she said once to the camera. "I raised a good boy. One who didn't wait to be ready before he started." The crew followed her to Michael's old school, where they filmed her walking the halls slowly, fingers grazing lockers, memories whispering from every corner. One teacher cried during the interview. Another opened a closet and pulled out a dusty box of Michael's science fair ribbons. "He made us all believe," the man said, holding up a paper rocket model with Michael's signature in fading ink. At the SpaceX facility, Helen was greeted like family now. She wore a soft gray shawl and walked beside the producers as they filmed the engineers analyzing Michael's designs. One room had become a sort of quiet shrine, not solemn but reverent. His pages hung framed beside modern schematics, now built on his foundation. A voiceover booth was set up in the corner. Elon arrived later that afternoon, in jeans and a calm black shirt, and sat before the mic without ceremony. "He didn't just leave us with an idea," Elon said, voice thick. "He reminded us what real imagination looks like." And Helen changed the course of our thinking. Not with theory, but with courage. Then came the tapes. Helen hadn't seen them in years. They were in an old shoebox in the hall closet, buried under winter scarves and a broken clock. VHS tapes, labeled in Michael's childhood handwriting, "First rocket try," and "Me talking to future," scribbled in marker. The film crew digitized the footage. They invited Helen to watch on a small monitor, and she hesitated only a second before nodding. The screen flickered, then steadied. A boy's face appeared, maybe 10 years old, glasses askew, hair sticking up in every direction. He was speaking fast, almost breathless with excitement. "So this one probably won't go more than 3 feet, he said, gesturing to a bottle wrapped in foil. "But next time, I think if I seal it better and maybe adjust the air pressure." The camera shook from the person filming. Helen's voice could be heard laughing. And then came something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. Michael looked into the camera, eyes suddenly serious. "Mom, if someone sees this one day, like someone who really builds stuff, tell them I tried. Tell them I wanted to help." Helen's hand rose to her chest. Her mouth trembled. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. "I'd forgotten," she whispered, tears slipping soundlessly down her cheeks. "I'd forgotten the sound of his laugh." The documentary team did something unusual. They invited students, kids from local schools, teen interns from the Aerospace Academy, even a few who had written letters to Helen, to help with parts of the production. Some helped with lighting. Others assisted in editing. A 12-year-old girl composed a gentle piano piece for the ending credits. One boy, age 14, drew animations of Michael's early sketches as transitions between scenes. It wasn't just a film anymore. It was a tapestry. When it was done, they titled it The Notebook That Rose. It premiered quietly on a public network and a streaming site. No billboards, no glamour, just a quiet story gently told. At the end of the documentary, Helen's voice, recorded in her home, closed the film. Mothers don't just raise children. We raise futures. We light lanterns we'll never see shine. And if we're lucky, someone will carry that light forward. The world responded. Letters came from everywhere, printed and handwritten, emailed, and left on doorsteps. Young engineers sent photos of their own notebooks, scrawled with early dreams and equations. Teachers assigned the film in class. Science clubs took inspiration from Michael's concepts. A group of middle schoolers in Kansas built a small rocket and named it the Hargrove Hope. One night, after the rush of filming had passed and the world had quieted again, Helen sat alone in her living room, shawl draped around her shoulders, the silver rocket model gleaming softly on the mantel beside the old photograph. She watched the credits roll on the screen. Her name, Michael's name, the dedication, the piano theme drifted through the room like a lullaby. As the final frame faded to black, Helen whispered, barely loud enough for the room to hear, "We're alive, my son." And in that moment, it felt entirely true. Not metaphor, not sentiment, but truth, because his voice now echoed in classrooms. His sketches lived on lab walls. His dreams stirred others awake. And her love, fierce, steady, tireless, had not just endured. It had risen. Helen awoke on her 75th birthday with no expectations. There would be no cake, no candles, no streamers hanging from a ceiling. She wasn't one for celebrations, not anymore. She simply hoped for a quiet day, a walk around the neighborhood if her knees permitted, maybe a visit to Michael's photo on the mantel, and a cup of her favorite tea while watching the birds from her small kitchen window. So when she received a formal invitation from SpaceX the week before, she assumed it was a formality, some small ceremony, perhaps another meeting or quiet thank you. She didn't expect the van that arrived precisely at 8 a.m. or the chauffeur who greeted her by name with a gentle smile. She didn't expect the bouquet of wildflowers laid across the back seat. She certainly didn't expect what awaited her inside. The entrance to the SpaceX facility was brighter that day, somehow. The usual hum of activity was present, but there was a gentler energy in the air, like the building itself had paused for a breath. Helen stepped through the lobby doors with her soft beige shawl draped over her shoulders, her hands carefully folded in front of her. As she was guided toward the old prototype wing, she noticed the walls had been freshly painted. There were framed photographs now, children at science fairs, families gathered around small rocket models, close-ups of Michael's earliest sketches. At the end of the hallway, a new brass plaque gleamed under the light. It read, "For those who dare as Michael dared." Helen stopped walking. Her throat tightened. But she wasn't allowed to linger in silence for long, because the door beside the plaque swung open, and laughter, high-pitched and sincere, spilled into the corridor. Inside, the Michael room had changed. Once a quiet exhibit of drawings and calculations, it had become a vibrant space of invention. Long wooden tables were scattered with tools and models, prototypes built from plastic, wire, and curiosity. The walls bore giant whiteboards full of sketches and questions written in a dozen different hands. Children, dozens of them, stood in small clusters, beaming as she entered. Some wore goggles too big for their faces. Others held notebooks. They had waited for her. Helen didn't speak at first. She simply looked, the way one looks at a blooming tree in the middle of winter. A teacher touched her elbow gently. "They know who you are," she whispered, "and what you've done." Before Helen could reply, a small girl with two messy braids and a yellow dress ran forward, holding a gift wrapped in bright blue paper. "This is for you," she said, her voice shy but insistent. "It's from all of us." Helen's fingers trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a brand new leather-bound notebook. Dark brown, thick, soft to the touch. Its pages were blank. She blinked at it. "For me?" she asked quietly. The little girl nodded. "It's for you to start now, 'cause you have ideas too." Helen had no words. No one had ever said that to her before. In the back of the room, Elon had been standing quietly. He stepped forward now, without his usual entourage, and sat cross-legged on the floor beside her like an old friend settling in. The room quieted. "You didn't just come to show us what once was," he said, voice low and warm. "You came to help us build what's next." Helen opened the notebook on her lap. Her hands still trembled, but with reverence now, not doubt. Slowly, with deliberate grace, she picked up a nearby pen and wrote on the first page in her careful handwriting. "This notebook belongs to a mother who learned to dream again." There was no applause, just silence, the kind of silence that holds meaning. Then the children gathered around her, sitting at her feet as though it were story time. One boy leaned his head against her leg. A girl opened her own notebook and mirrored Helen's posture. "Tell us about Michael," one of them asked. So she did. She told them about the kitchen experiments, the nights spent sketching by flashlight, the first time he tried to launch a soda bottle into the sky. She told them about how he stayed curious, even when the world grew quiet around him. She told them about his hospital room and his final words. The children listened, eyes wide, hearts open. And as Helen spoke, something remarkable happened. The lines on her face softened, the weight on her shoulders lifted, if only slightly. Her voice grew steadier, more certain. She smiled, not the tight, polite smile of obligation, but the kind that rises from somewhere deep and real. Outside, the afternoon sun spilled gold across the glass panes. Light danced across the tables, catching on the silver bolts of half-finished inventions. Teachers and engineers alike watched from a respectful distance, no one interrupting. Later, one child stood on tiptoe and asked, "Do you think I can build something that flies?" Helen looked at her and said, "I don't just think it, I know it." They stayed in that room for hours. Helen listened as much as she spoke. She looked over blueprints made in crayon, helped fix a crooked wheel on a cardboard rover, and told one boy that his motor design reminded her of something Michael once drew when he was 10. That child beamed. At the end of the day, when it was time to go, Helen turned once more toward the golden plaque at the door. She reached out and ran her fingers along the words, "For those who dare." She smiled. She wasn't just remembering anymore. She was daring too. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, sketches, and new beginnings, Helen didn't feel 75. She felt possible. The morning was still. Not in the way of lifelessness, but in the kind of quiet that holds meaning. Helen stood on the small wooden porch of her home, wrapped in her cream shawl, holding a mug of chamomile tea close to her chest. She didn't drink it yet, just held it, letting the warmth seep through her fingers, grounding her. Today wasn't just any launch. It wasn't the first time she'd watched a SpaceX rocket take to the skies. She'd been to the control rooms, had stood beside engineers, even sat next to Elon Musk himself during the test of the first H prototype. But this time, she wasn't going anywhere. She had chosen her own front porch, humble, familiar, as the right place to witness this. Because today, Michael was going too. Somewhere deep within the payload bay of the capsule, nestled among commemorative items, mission flags, and time capsules destined for orbit, there was a tiny leather-bound replica of Michael's notebook. The very one that had changed everything. Hand-stitched by one of the SpaceX engineers, it held miniaturized scans of his most meaningful sketches, his formulas, his margin notes about dreams and stars and propulsion systems drawn on coffee-stained pages. It wasn't a technical tool. It wasn't necessary to the mission. It was something more. It was memory. It was tribute. It was love carried into the stars. Helen sat on her old rocking chair, the one Michael had helped paint when he was 10. It had chipped since then, the wood softened by time and Texas summers, but still held her. Her tea remained untouched, cooling slowly. On her lap was the same blue and gold brooch engraved with inspiration, Michael H. And beside her, resting on a small table, was a folded newspaper clipping. SpaceX to launch symbolic item in honor of late engineer's dream. She didn't need to read it again. She just needed to listen. From a small portable radio next to the mug came the countdown, clear and solemn. 10. A breeze swept gently through the yard, nudging the wildflowers that framed her porch. Some of them, she couldn't believe it, had begun blooming again. The same wild snapdragons and daisies Michael had planted as a child. She'd thought they'd vanished years ago. 9. 8. Helen's fingers gripped the arms of the chair. 7. 6. She raised her eyes to the horizon. The sky was flawless. No clouds, just a wide canvas of soft blue stretching endlessly above her, as though the world had tidied itself for this moment. 5. 4. 3. She exhaled slowly, her breath shaky but calm. There was no fear in her, no tension. Just wait, the kind that love brings when it spans lifetimes. 2. 1. And then it rose. The rocket lifted into the sky, its fire blazing with precision and quiet power. From where Helen sat, she couldn't hear the rumble, only the voice from the radio narrating every stage. But she saw the column of light, the line of hope etched against the morning. The rocket climbed, higher, straighter, and Helen watched with tear-lined eyes, lips parted slightly, as though drinking in every second. A single star remained visible in the daylight sky. Just one, and perhaps it was science. Perhaps it was timing or atmosphere. But to Helen, it shimmered, just for her. She closed her eyes. And there it was, his voice. Not imagined, remembered. "We did it, Mom." It was how he used to sound when he managed something that felt too big for a boy his age. When his soda bottle rocket lifted off the swing's set ramp. When he fixed the old toaster with rubber bands and instinct. When he wrote the words to Elon Musk one day. On the cover of his first notebook, Helen let the tears fall silently. There was no grief in them anymore. Only awe. She could almost feel his presence. Not in the poetic way of memory, but in the ordinary ways that hurt the most, his laughter echoing faintly, his hand tugging at her sleeve. She imagined him standing barefoot beside her, maybe 12 years old again, pointing up at the sky and saying, "I always knew it had worked, didn't you?" And this time, she would say yes. "I did." Back on the radio, the voice confirmed. Separation successful. Capsule stable. Trajectory optimal. Helen smiled, but not with exuberance. It was a gentle smile. The kind that comes when the world no longer owes you anything because it already gave you back more than you ever expected. She reached for the tea and sipped. It was cold. She didn't care. Later that afternoon, neighbors would pass by, asking if she saw the launch. The mailman would hand her a package with a commemorative pin from SpaceX. A letter from a girl in Montana would arrive next week saying, "My dad died last year. I draw rockets now too." But in that moment, just then, it was only her. Her and the sky. And in the garden, almost shyly, the blooms leaned toward the sun. The snapdragons, those stubborn little survivors, swayed as though waving goodbye. The wind stilled. Everything, time, the trees, the breath in her chest, seemed to pause in reverence. Not for the rocket, not for the science, but for a promise fulfilled. "You kept your word," the world seemed to whisper. And Helen, without ceremony, without need for witness, closed her eyes, held her breath, and quietly whispered back, "Thank you." It was a quiet Tuesday morning, months after the last launch, when Helen found the envelope. It was tucked inside the worn cover of a forgotten book, a physics manual once owned by Michael, left untouched for years on the high shelf in the corner of her living room. She had taken the book down only to dust, intending to give it to the new science teacher at the neighborhood school. But as she opened it, something slipped out. It was an envelope, no stamp, no return address, just her name written in her son's unmistakable handwriting, "For Mom, someday." Her heart slowed. Fingers trembling, she sat down at the kitchen table, sunlight dappling the wood through the curtains. She stared at the envelope for a long while, her thumb tracing over the letters like a blind woman memorizing the contours of something sacred. Then she carefully opened it. The letter inside was dated almost 12 years earlier. "Mom, if you're reading this, then something worked. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough that my words still matter. Enough that I'm not entirely gone." Helen pressed her lips together and brought a hand to her mouth. The penmanship was uneven, the ink slightly smudged in places, the unmistakable hand of someone writing while in pain, but writing anyway. "I know you. You'd keep going even when no one's looking. You'd carry the whole sky on your back if you thought it would help someone else stand taller. I used to wonder if you knew how rare that is." She could hear his voice. It wasn't the weak one from the hospital bed. No, this was the boy in the basement, voice bright with discovery, shouting for her to come look at something made from bottle caps and wires. It was the teenager on the kitchen floor, sketching on napkins, telling her about propulsion like it was poetry. "I'm scared, Mom. Not just of leaving, but of leaving nothing. Not finishing. Not being heard. But then I remember I have you." Helen's breath caught. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, and read the next line 3 times before she could move on. "You are the only person who can make sure my voice continues. Not because you're loud, but because you're the kind of quiet that lasts." The page was worn at the bottom, the folds softened by time. There was a sketch, almost childlike, a rocket drawn simply with 2 small seats near the top. Underneath it, in bold letters, her son had written, "You're going with me, one way or another." Helen let out a small, shaky laugh through her tears. She traced the little drawing with her fingertip. It was like he had folded part of his soul into the page and left it there, waiting for the right time. She stood and walked to her bedroom, where a space above her bed had remained bare for years. She gently pressed the letter flat, placed it in a walnut frame, and hung it there, above where she laid her head every night. A compass, a comfort, a continuation. That evening, she didn't sleep. Not quite. But as her eyes closed and her breath slowed, a dream came, so vivid it made her chest ache with both joy and grief. Michael stood in a golden field, barefoot, not the frail man he'd become, but the boy she remembered, and yet somehow more. His white coat fluttered in the breeze, sleeves rolled up, that same stubborn cowlick in his hair. He was smiling, not politely, but with mischief, the way he used to when he'd hidden candy in her apron pocket. "Come on," he said. "You walk slow now." She joined him. They didn't rush. There was no need to. The sky was vast and soft above them, the kind of sky you could fall into. Then he stopped and pointed up. "See that one?" he asked, and she followed his gaze. High above, a rocket arced across the heavens, not with fire, but with grace, like a brushstroke drawn by time itself. "That's the one," he said. "The one with the motor I dreamed up." She looked back at him. "Is it really up there?" He nodded. "And you helped it get there." In the dream, Helen didn't cry. She simply stood beside him, holding his hand, and said the words she had said to herself so many times over the years, "I knew you could." She woke with tears on her cheeks and the faintest echo of warmth in her palm. The framed letter was still above her bed. The house was still quiet. But something had changed, not just in her, but around her. That day, she made herself a cup of tea and sat on the porch again. The air smelled of magnolia. The small tree Michael had planted behind the shed had blossomed late that year. 3 white flowers had opened overnight. She took it as a hello. The world moved on as it always does. There would be more launches, more young minds with notebooks, more missions beyond the horizon. But for Helen, nothing would ever compare to the day she heard his voice again, not from the stars, but from the page. Because in the end, some letters don't just arrive late. They arrive when they're needed most. 1 year had passed since the world watched a rocket rise into sky, carried by an engine born from the dreams of a boy who never got to see it fly. And yet somehow he did. In every bolt, in every thread of flame that traced the clouds, Michael's spirit had found its way. And Helen, Once a quiet janitor, known only by her first name and soft smile, had become a voice. Not loud, never loud, but steady. At 73 now, Helen moved through auditoriums, classrooms, and science fairs with the same grace that once carried her silently through empty office hallways. She wore simple clothes, always neat, always modest, and a pin over her heart, a tiny rocket engraved with the initials MH. Her hands no longer cleaned chalkboards. Now they held microphones, letters, and the eager palms of young people leaning forward to ask her how to keep believing. She always answered the same way. I'm not an engineer. I'm a mother. But a heart that listens can change the world. Every time she said it, the room grew still. Because everyone, no matter how advanced their equations or dreams, longed to be heard that deeply. In one of those events, after she spoke of nights filled with coughing from the basement and mornings spent stitching uniforms to buy rice and pencils, a young woman stood up. She was shaking slightly. Her voice cracked. How do we keep going when we're alone? Helen looked at her for a long moment before answering. You're never really alone, she said gently. Someone taught your heart to care. That love didn't vanish. It became part of you. Later that month, a small independent publisher approached her after a lecture. We'd like to share your story in a book, the editor said. Yours and Michael's. Helen hesitated. The world had already taken so much from her. But then she remembered Michael's voice, full of conviction even in his hospital bed. They need to know, Mom. Even if I'm not here, they need to know. She nodded, but only under one condition. His name comes first, she said. He dreamed it. I just kept it alive. The book was titled Wings for a Son, the story of Michael and his mother. It was translated into 8 languages. In Brazil, they called it Asas para Filho. In Japan, the title was simply Heart Engine, but the spirit remained the same. Letters poured in from every corner of the globe, from children who had never seen a rocket, from mothers who had buried dreams beside tiny gravestones, from teachers who had almost given up trying. Helen read each one, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence, tears quietly soaking the corners of envelopes. And yet, despite all the recognition, all the invitations and awards, she never left her home. It was still the same small house with creaking steps and a teapot that hissed too soon. The same photo of Michael, now placed on a shelf beside a framed copy of the rocket patent and a fading brooch. On the wall behind her writing desk, she'd hung a map of the stars. One of them bore Michael's name, a quiet reminder that the universe had heard her son. One golden afternoon, as cicadas buzzed softly outside and the wind carried the scent of jasmine through the open window, Helen sat on her porch with a cup of tea and her new notebook. It had been a birthday gift from a group of young engineers. The cover was soft brown leather, its spine stitched by hand. Inside, the first page held a note. You gave us his dream. Now give us yours. Helen smiled as she traced the blank paper with her fingertips. Then she picked up her pen and began to write, her letters small but certain. If you're holding a story inside you, tell it. Someone needs to hear it. Someone is waiting to feel less alone because of it. She paused, looked up. The sun was folding into the horizon, pouring its amber light across the tops of the trees, the same ones Michael had climbed, barefoot and breathless, when he was just a boy building rockets out of soda bottles. She could almost hear his laugh in the leaves, almost see him running, dirt on his knees, joy in his bones. And though time had taken so much, it hadn't taken that. Because love, real love, doesn't vanish. It becomes a bridge from what was to what still can be. Helen sat back and closed the notebook gently. Around her, the evening wrapped the world in quiet. She wasn't young. She wasn't famous. But she had become something rare, a flame that warmed without burning, that showed others how to carry light. And so, dear viewer, if you've been listening, really listening, maybe you felt that flame too. Maybe it reminded you of something, or someone. If so, I'd love to know. Leave in the comments a memory this story brought back to you. I read each one with care. Truly,